Indian students, especially those in elementary schools, not learning enough? Well, multiple assessments both by government and private agencies point to that. And here it is, input and outcome, the two gears of the education engine that the Indian government is struggling to keep pace with. School enrollments have zoomed to over 97%, but getting more children into schools has not really translated into more education. According to the National Achievement Survey of 2018, only 13% of class 10 students could correctly answer more than half the questions for mathematics, and 11% could do the same for science. Just last month, the annual Status of Education report highlighted that still only half of all students in class 5 can read texts meant for class 2 students, and over 70% children in rural India in class 5 still cannot solve basic arithmetic problems. Private schools fare better, but only relatively. However, there has been small but steady catching up in certain states. ASER 2018 also highlighted states like Himachal Pradesh, for instance, that showed reading ability improvement of nearly 8 percentage points. Chhattisgarh and Orissa saw 7 percentage points improvement between 2016 and 2018. Haryana saw a 5 percentage point increase in reading ability for class 5 students. It also fared well on basic arithmetic skills. Uttar Pradesh was a surprise performer with significant improvements recorded both in reading and basic arithmetic. These are a result of some reforms, some on a mission mode, others in parts. But are they enough? Has the focus moved from enrollments to quality of education? Hello and welcome. I'm Archana Shukla, and on this episode of Get Schooled, we discuss the learnings from these states and how to scale up these initiatives. And to discuss this with me is Mr. Alok Kumar, advisor at Niti Aayog, Gaurav Goyal, CEO of Samagra, Prachi Vindlas of the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, and Yamini Iyer, President and Chief Executive at the Center for Policy Research. Well, gentlemen and ladies, thank you so much for joining me here on CNBC TV 18 on this very special discussion on Get School. But to begin with, let me come to Mr. Alok Kumar first. Mr. Kumar, on the India Action Plan 2020, Niti Aayog had highlighted a list of recommendations and plans that it intends to take forward in transforming school education, and the focus there was on transforming and focusing now more on outcomes. How far do you think have we progressed on that plan? We are in the third year of that India Action Plan right now.
A lot of progress has been made. And as if you would recall, there were at least 4 or 5 action points which we are following. One of them was the issue of subscale schools and try to consolidate them into more efficient units where we can concentrate our teaching resources and make better use of them. So there is some progress made on this in Rajasthan, in Jharkhand, in other states as well. The second element of the transformation was about how do we bring the discussion from inputs, which is school buildings, teacher vacancies, teacher training, textbooks, midday meal, from them to learning outcomes. And if you look at 3 initiatives in this regard, first, it required identification of competencies itself, that a grade 5 students need to have this level of competency. So that is out now in public domain. It has been released. Every state knows what is the competency that is required to be achieved. The second question was then to measure those competencies and to see, and you see the kind of NAS exercise that we have carried out this year at a level which is generalizable up till district level with a very large sample size. That shows that the government is serious about the intent of measuring learning outcomes. And over a period of time, as we track this NAS performance, we would see, and the schools would see, and the teachers would get a feedback as to how their schools are performing. So it is not only about schools, but also now about individual students now with technology, and there are many MIS systems where it is now possible, for instance, in Rajasthan, the Shala Darpan program, it is now possible to track individual students.
Mr. Kumar, on the assessment part, if I can bring in a question here, there was also a plan to bring in School Education Quality Index. We haven't heard much from Niti on what the status for that is, how it works, by when do we see it come on?
today that the school education quality index it got delayed a little bit because the NAS itself exercise got delayed a bit. So now we are ready with the school education quality index. It is in the vetting process at the Niti Aayog and at the topmost levels, and we should be able to release it very soon. One other point.
Yeah, go ahead.
The aspirational district program of the Niti Aayog, which targets the 117 such districts with the poorest human capital indicators. And even in that, you see almost 30% of weightage to educational and educational related outcomes. And that itself has released a huge amount of focus and received a huge amount of focus from the state governments, from the district administrations and from the teachers themselves to really now focus. So in a sense, we were not questioning enough, we were not asking enough of the system accountability towards learning outcomes. We were asking their accountability on different parameters.
Gaurav, if I can come to you, you are working with states like Haryana, Himachal and Andhra Pradesh on trying to help them transform governance as well as on the academic and pedagogy level. What have been the biggest challenges that you have, faced while implementing and working with these states on a systemic level?
So, as you're rightly saying, the approach in some of these states has been a systemic approach, which essentially means that there's a comprehensive strategy which comprises of both governance reforms on one side and academic interventions on the other to together basically improve learning outcomes in the states. So when you talk about such a massive transformation in any state, it requires a lot of political will, it requires a lot of bureaucratic will, it requires fundamental decisions that may not always be kind of pleasant in the short run. But if you want to kind of comprehensively do all of it, then there are different pieces of the puzzle that need to be solved. And typically what we have seen that states are able to move forward on some of these, right, while others may take time.
Gaurav, just one question. How much focus do we put on reforming governance versus reforming what's happening inside the classroom? What is the focus that, you are putting in the states that you're working with?
Yeah. See, at the core of it, when you want to improve learning outcomes, you have to focus on academics, right? Which could, as I said, involves focusing on competencies as opposed to lesson completion, having the right remedial program for those students who have been left behind in the system, right? Having the right assessments framework and so on. But if you come to think of it, none of it is going to work in a classroom if, let's say, the teachers are not there in the first instance. There's 30% vacancies of teachers, or the teachers are distributed across schools in a manner that the pupil-teacher ratio in the state is very, very skewed across schools. If the system is not holding them accountable for learning outcomes. So all of these governance-related things become very, very critical, because without them in isolation, only academic interventions are not going to get us the results. And therefore, the entire thing on systemic transformation and the effort that is currently underway with NITI now is to kind of see if we can take learnings from some of the states who have pioneered this comprehensive approach, systemic approach, and come up with a set of best practices and a theory of change basis the learnings of these states.
Prachi, we are talking about taking the learnings from certain states, trying to apply it in other states. How easy or difficult do you think this is going to be? Every state has a different priority, every state has different needs, every state has different levels of learning.
Archana, there are several themes which are already emerging from the work in these states, which are showing strong trends in the states in which they are trying, them. For example, the core of all of this work is the academic reform, the definition and establishment of competency frameworks in the states, structured remediation, and transforming the entire teaching learning around them, transforming and shifting the accountability around competencies and not around inputs, as Mr. Alok Kumar also said. Making this data available, making the student data available at a frequency that teachers can close the loop in the classrooms, as well as the entire system can start using it for the purpose of monitoring and for the purpose of fixing the changes as they're needed. So if you ask me how many of these are scalable, I think many of these are eminently scalable, because these are very fundamental changes which in some form or format are already being conducted in all states in India.
Yamini, there have been certain states that have performed performed well if we go by the ASA 2018 data, but there were also states which have actually shown a decline, states like Bihar, where we actually saw that learning outcomes somewhere have come down as well. How do you think the states are dealing with this input versus learning outcome debate?
India is a diverse country. As you yourself pointed out, the ASA results and all the other assessments that we have talk of diversity across states. Even more important, within states you see a significant diversity. You see diversity across districts, and perhaps the greatest challenge in education is that you even see diversity within the classroom. So each classroom is unique because the kinds of learning capacities and competencies that the children within a particular classroom have acquired or have a lot of variability. And therefore it is only natural that you're going to see significant differences. There are states that have historically made greater strides in education outcomes, and so you do see that the gap between states that have been left behind and states that are moving forward is now in fact widening, which is a new and important challenge. There are no magic bullet solutions. There is no one-size-fits-all. But I think the most at the core of all of this is how do you create a governance architecture that enables the kind of flexibility that is required to allow schools to adapt to the kinds of peculiar challenges that they face as they address the problem of learning. That means that we have to get a lot more comfortable with a much more decentralized education system. Currently, whether it is state schemes or the central schemes, we have a very, very centralized architecture, which is the antithesis of what we need to achieve in order to be able to resolve the learning crisis and, most importantly, address this diversity and inequality of learning outcomes across states.
Well, we'll carry forward this very important conversation on Get Schooled on the other side of this break. Time for a very, very short break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back on Get Schooled. We are discussing what certain states have achieved when it comes to learning outcomes and how scalable are those initiatives. Yamini, do you think, dealing with this governance issue is also largely to do with how the budget allocations happen and somewhere that defines the priority for the government as well?
To my mind, there are two challenges with financing of education. One, of course, we don't spend enough. But I think that that is a problem we will be able to overcome if we are able to figure out how do we spend well. Right now, our entire system, it's on paper supposed to be a bottom-up system that starts at the school and then gets negotiated at the center. In practice, as we have been studying the planning system very closely over many years, this is a very centralized, top-down driven way in which budgets gets allocated. There's very little predictability in terms of the quantum of money that finally reaches states, districts, and eventually schools, all of which end up prioritizing a system which is focusing a lot more on spending for infrastructure and a lot less on spending for learning. Let me just give you an important example. Within the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, there are very clear budget items which are focused on quality. For example, learning enhancement programs, teacher training programs, innovation programs. In times of budget constraints, these are programs that receive the least amount of priority. And in fact, if you look at the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan budget, even for this year, these programs amount for about 19 or 20% of the total budget.
And Mr. Alok Kumar, please come in on this point. A lot of funding goes into infrastructure, like Yamini was pointing out. And I was reading some of the budget documents. Last fiscal, only 2% of the entire budget was spent on teacher training, which essentially is one of the core issues and requirements to improve education in India. How is Niti Aayog trying to change this?
If you ask for access, you will get access, because you were for the last 15-16 years you were really focusing very heavily on access. The focus has now changed, I think, and in the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan, if you see, there's a lot of decentralization, and also one hopes that this top-down approach will, and I totally agree with Yamini when she says that the decentralized approach with a school as a unit and school as a viable unit, not as a unviable or a subscale unit. If you have a school as a viable unit and you can grant them the autonomy to spend the resources in the manner, and you will be able to measure and fix accountability of schools to the learning outcomes, there is no reason why this change will not happen.
Sir, Yamini had a point to make. I would give her one chance and then you can answer her query.
No, it's not a query. I just wanted to, I completely agree, Alok, with what you're saying. I just wanted to add one thing. I think we also need to think a lot more about how we can make our systems aligned to being able to be responsive to the assessments. Because we've had such a centralized system, we also currently are dealing with another challenge, which is that all the actors in the system, particularly the teachers, the cluster resource supporters, the academic mentors to teachers and so on, all of them have adopted a very passive approach to how to deal with the problem of classrooms. It's often, and we've interviewed teachers for many years across different settings, and the standard response we always get, the challenge of the classroom is not a challenge of our own creation. It is a consequence of policy. It is about no detention. It is about the kind of students that come to the classroom. It is the fact that we are not allowed to focus on the classroom. They very rarely does the system acknowledge that we as teachers are empowered to fix this problem. And I think it links very closely to the fact that because it's been such a centralized system all along, it hasn't actually created a culture of that kind of agency that that school level actors need to have.
So Yamini,
I think a lot more thinking needs to be done about how one can do that.
So Yamini is pointing to you know, the biggest issue, which would be the next topic of our conversation, which is fixing accountability and using the data that we now have, whether it is NAS, ASR, or the other district level data, and you know, using that data to make our next action points and how far we've progressed. So Mr. Alok Kumar, please come in on that in terms of fixing accountability, making schools and teachers more accountable, making states more accountable. How is Niti Aayog working on that?
So you see, when we started working with the states, there are so many things that the governance setup, as Gaurav was pointing out, that you know, the academic intervention, teacher training is one part of the problem, but the governance aspect also. So I will give you one concrete example. The cluster resource person and the block resource persons who are supposed to academically mentor the teachers in many of the states that we worked with were selected only on the basis of seniority. Now, when you select those people on the basis of seniority, they had no passion for teaching, mentoring. Their idea was that they are senior and therefore they would go and they will ask, what are the questions they will ask, whether the buildings are okay or not, whether the midday meal scheme is being served or not. Plus the reports of the inspection reports, etc., were printed in a manual format. Nobody analyzed those, and there was no feedback to the teacher, nor to the district administrators on the quality aspects of teaching. So if you are not asking of it, it is not really helpful in terms of then saying that, oh, we are not getting this, but we are getting something on access. So the good thing is that now, so these policies also need change, and I agree with Yamini to some extent when she says that the centralized model of policy making without, and also the digital tools. So look at the digital tools of what was happening to individual students, what was happening to individual teachers, not as a measure to punish people, but also as a measure to give them feedback. So I didn't know, for instance, as a teacher, what proportion of my students are reaching grade level competence vis-a-vis what is the average prevailing in my block, what is the average prevailing in my districts, what is the average prevailing in my state. So I'm not asking let's say UP to be compared to Kerala, etc., or so on and so forth. What I'm trying to say is that even within UP, within the districts of UP, within the blocks of UP, where does my school stand? There was no systematic way of giving feedback to my teachers. So it is not fair to blame them or fair to say that we are not investing sufficiently in their training. Yes, of course, there is always potential to improve. And this is exactly the point which Niti Aayog is trying to do, is to synthesize those elements which we think can work. But different states will have different starting points. As rightly pointed out, I can't have a uniform solution across the country.
Right.
But the elements and the principles remain the same, and those are universal. And what we are trying to do here is to pitch these universal systems and universal principles across to the states, to then let them make their own plans and prioritize their own action.
Right. Prachi, Windlas, come in on this point here. How are the states looking at this accountability picture and, you know, allocation of budget picture? is there change in the methodology? Is there change in the way they look at prioritizing education?
Archana, let me provide some examples from the ground which will bring this to life. So the first step of that, which the state of Andhra Pradesh has taken, they've actually constituted an assessment cell, a 16-member assessment cell, which is being trained in world-class methods of student assessments, data analytics, and how does that information get created. So that's the step one. How does data actually get created for us to be able to take any action on that? Then how do you take that data back to the teachers? The excellent example is from the state of Haryana. They now have student assessments, competency-linked student assessments happening every 2 months in the entire state. The purpose of these assessments is that the data comes back to the teachers, to our educators. Now, having given this data in the hand of teachers, they've also enabled the parallel machinery over there, which is which is our district education officers, our block education officers, who are being given this data to be able to go and then structure their conversations with the teachers around these academic outcomes.
Yeah.
The point that we were all raising around accountability and monitoring. So Himachal, for example, has now made its monitoring performers 80% of the details that they're collecting are on academic outcomes.
Okay.
That's a huge shift from 20% to 80%. From a 50-point list that they used to collect, it's a 20-point list. They have given their block officers now an app on which that data is being captured live as those as those officers are in the schools. So there are many things in our existing frameworks, in our existing structures, which can be improved. The sad reality being that we are moving from a poor to a fair system.
I have very little time left, and I want to touch on this one very important aspect of private input in education increasing because learning outcomes and accountability in government schools is perceived to be lower than that of private schools. And Gaurav, let me get one word from you here on this. In the states that you are operating in, have we seen shifts back to government schools vis-a-vis private schools?
While these are still, I would say, early days to see a massive shift of that kind happen, but we have seen elements of that, for instance, happening in Himachal, right, where you see 2-3 trends. In the government schools first, based on the internal assessments of the state, the learning outcomes were going down, but over the last 2 to 3 years, they've kind of reversed the trend. Then the gap between government schools and private schools in terms of learning outcomes is kind of narrowing down. And the enrollment that was kind of shifting and was kind of going down, you see a reversal of trend, slight indication of that, where from private schools, students are now kind of looking at government schools as a viable alternative.
Okay.
So still, I would say early days when we can really kind of declare victory on something like that.
I give Mr. Alok Kumar the last word on this show, and the question is, private schools and government schools both really have not fared too well as far as learning outcomes and assessments are concerned. Your India Action Plan 2020 also highlighted how even government and private schools both should be regulated on outcomes, where the regulation should focus on the outcomes. What has been the progress on that part, sir?
Improving teacher learning outcomes will not really be an exercise in negativity. I mean, to point out, regulate, close down. What is the purpose? The point is to give them feedback, and in terms of measuring, giving them help in robust measurement of the competencies, and then giving them feedback that, look, this is where your school stands.
Right.
And also trying to involve, and that create a Jan Andolan around it. And one of the things which we found works is how do we get the parent teachers into the parents involved into the school management. Delhi government has tried some excellent initiatives where parents have been involved. And you see, if the parents start getting a feeling that the child is learning new things, then I think you will get a strong support for the schooling system, both in the public and the private. And I am not one to say that, this one is better or that one is better. What I am trying to say is whichever system the parents are comfortable with, the student is comfortable with, can we improve learning outcomes sitting in those
Right. Well, and at the center of all of the reforms has to be the child that goes to school to gain education. Well, on this note, Mr. Alok Kumar, Gaurav Goyal, Yamini Iyer and Prachi Vindlas, thank you very much for joining us here on CNBC TV 18. The subject of school education is quite vast and reforms need to be discussed. We'll come back with more such focused discussions on Get Schooled. Many thanks for watching this special episode.